The wind did not howl so much as it shrieked, a high and tearing sound that seemed to strip the warmth right out of the blood. Thorne stopped at the ridge line, his boots sinking deep into the crust of the drift, and looked back only once. There was no smoke rising from the valley floor anymore, or perhaps the blizzard was simply too thick to see it, masking the ruins of the life he had spent 30 years building. It did not matter. The deed was papered and stamped. The men with the badges had done their work, and the fire had finished the rest. He turned his face into the biting gale, the leather of his coat stiffening with frost, and looked down at the animal shivering beside his leg. Scout, a German shepherd with a coat the color of burnt timber and eyes that held an ancient, wordless trust, whined low in his throat, lifting a paw from the freezing powder. Thorne reached down, his gloves cracked and worn, and rested a heavy hand on the dog's head, feeling the tremor of cold running through the animal's frame. "We keep moving," Thorne said, his voice a rough gravel sound against the wind. "Moving is living." They had no wagon, no horse, and no pack mule. Those had been seized or scattered in the chaos of the eviction. Thorne carried only what he could strap to his back or jam into his pockets in those final frantic minutes. A heavy wool roll, a tin cup that clattered against his hip, a hunting knife in a sheath that had seen better decades, and a rifle with a stock scarred by years of saddle wear. He was 50 years old, a man whose joints complained with the damp, and whose beard was streaked with the gray of hard winters, yet he moved with the grim, plodding determination of a mule. The destination was not a town. He had no coin for a room and no patience for the charity of strangers who would look at a man of his age with pity. His destination was a jagged scar of black rock halfway up the canyon wall, a natural recess he had spotted years ago while tracking a wounded elk. It was a cave, nothing more than a geological mistake in the granite, but it was the only thing left that the bank and the flames could not take from him. The climb was brutal, a punishment on lungs that burned with the intake of sub-zero air. Every step required a calculation of energy, a lifting of heavy legs against the resistance of the snow. Scout scrambled ahead, claws scrabbling on hidden ice, then paused to look back, checking that his master was still following. The dog was the only family Thorne had left, the only witness to the humiliation of the morning, and the only reason Thorne hadn't simply sat down in a snowbank to let the cold take him. When they finally reached the lip of the cave, the sun was already dipping behind the peaks, casting the world in a bruised purple twilight. Thorne stumbled inside, out of the direct lash of the wind, and dropped his pack. The silence of the cave was sudden and heavy. He took stock immediately, his breath pluming in the stagnant air. "Inventory," he muttered, a habit from his days running fence lines. He laid the items out on the dry, dusty stone floor. A box of lucifer matches, half full. A small sack of cornmeal, maybe 3 pounds. A strip of dried beef, tough as leather. The rifle and 6 rounds of ammunition. A coil of rusted wire. The blanket. It was a pathetic pile, a collection of refuse that amounted to the sum total of his existence. He looked at Scout, who was shaking violently now that the exertion of the climb had faded. Thorne sat on the cold stone, pulled the dog against his chest, and wrapped the single wool blanket around them both. "It's just tonight," Thorne whispered, rubbing the dog's flanks to generate friction. "Just tonight, old boy. We figure the rest tomorrow." The darkness swallowed the canyon, leaving them huddled in the void, 2 heartbeats against the crushing weight of winter. The morning light did not bring warmth. It brought only a harsh, gray clarity to their predicament. The cave was deep enough to escape the snow, but it was wide and had a high, arching mouth that vacuumed the heat out into the atmosphere. Thorne woke with stiff limbs, his hip aching where it had pressed against the unyielding stone floor. Scout was already up, pacing the perimeter of their stone box, his nails clicking rhythmically. Thorne sat up and groaned, the sound echoing off the walls. The cold was a physical presence, a weight that sat on his shoulders. He knew, with the pragmatic certainty of a man who had lived his life outdoors, that they would not survive another night without modifying the environment. The wind chill would drop well below zero again, and a single blanket was not enough to hold back hypothermia for 2 bodies. "Work to do," Thorne said, standing and stomping his feet to force circulation back into his toes. He approached the mouth of the cave. The opening was too large, nearly 10 feet across. He needed to shrink it. He stepped out into the drifts, scanning the scree slope below the entrance. It was littered with loose rock, jagged chunks of granite and shale that had fallen from the cliffs above over the centuries. He began the labor immediately. He did not have gloves thick enough for this, but he worked until his hands were raw, hauling stones from the slope up to the cave mouth. It was back-breaking work, the kind of labor that younger men complained about, but Thorne fell into a rhythm, a trance of exertion. Lift, carry, stack. Lift, carry, stack. He was building a windbreak, a low wall across the bottom half of the entrance to deflect the creeping air currents that hugged the ground. Scout, sensing the purpose in the movement, tried to help in his own way, dragging smaller sticks and debris toward the pile, tail wagging tentatively. Thorne paused to watch the dog, a rare, faint smile touching his eyes. "Good lad," he said, breathless. "Every bit helps." The wall grew slowly. It was not a mason's work. There was no mortar, no precise fitting. It was a dry stack barrier, rough and ugly, gaps plugged with handfuls of mud and wet snow that froze almost instantly into a bonding agent. By midday the wall was waist-high, narrowing the entrance significantly. Thorne stopped, his chest heaving, sweat freezing on his forehead. He could feel the difference already inside the cave. The wind no longer swept the floor. It passed over the top of the wall, leaving the air near the ground still. But stillness was not heat. The cave was a refrigerator, insulating the cold just as well as it might eventually insulate warmth. Thorne looked at the back of the cave, where the ceiling dipped lower. That would be the sleeping quarter. He began to move the larger rocks he couldn't lift, rolling them end over end to create a second, smaller enclosure within the cave, a room within a room. This smaller space would trap their body heat more effectively. He worked without food, his stomach a hollow pit, knowing that stopping to eat the meager rations now would only make the fatigue hit harder. He was driven by a fear he would never admit aloud, the fear of failing the animal that watched him with such absolute faith. By the time the light began to fail again, the cave had changed. It was no longer just a hole in the rock. It had structure. It had a defined perimeter. It was the skeleton of a home. The sun vanished, and the temperature plummeted with terrifying speed. The work on the wall had kept Thorne's blood moving, but now that he had stopped, the sweat on his skin turned to ice. He needed fire. It was not a luxury. It was a medical necessity. He had the matches, precious, finite little sticks of sulfur and wood, but he had no fuel. The landscape outside was a white desert of snow, covering the scrub brush and pine falls. Thorne grabbed the hatchet, which he had nearly forgotten was looped through his belt, and signaled to Scout. "Hunt for wood," he commanded softly. They ventured out onto the slope. The snow was knee-deep. Thorne scanned the tree line below. The standing trees were green wood, full of sap and moisture. They would smoke and hiss, but give no heat. He needed deadfall. He spotted a skeletal limb of a pine jutting out from a drift 50 yards down. He waded toward it, the physical effort burning the last of his energy reserves. He hacked at the limb, the sound of the hatchet sharp and lonely in the vast valley. The wood was brittle, snapping with a dry crack that promised flammability. He dragged the large branch back up the slope, gasping for air, while Scout carried smaller twigs in his jaws. Inside the cave, behind his new windbreak wall, Thorne prepared the hearth. He cleared a circle of dust and arranged a base of flat stones to reflect the heat. He was meticulous. One mistake, one wasted match, was a step toward death. He took his knife and shaved the dry inner core of the pine branch, creating a pile of curling, paper-thin shavings. He built a small pyramid of twigs over it. His hands were shaking so badly from the cold that he dropped the first match. He cursed, a sharp, violent sound, and picked it up. It was wet from the snow on his glove. Ruined. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and wiped his hands on the inside of his coat. He struck the second match. The flare was blinding in the gloom. He cupped it instantly, shielding the fragile flame as he touched it to the pine shavings. For a second, nothing happened. Then, a curl of smoke. Then, a tiny tongue of orange. Thorn fed it oxygen, blowing gently, coaxing the life out of the wood. The fire caught, climbing the pyramid of twigs. He added larger sticks, then the split logs. The cave, which had been a tomb of gray shadows, suddenly danced with orange light. The smell of burning pine, sharp, resinous, and clean, filled the space, masking the scent of wet dog and old dust. Thorn sat back, extending his hands toward the flames. The pain of the thaw was excruciating as blood rushed back into his fingertips, stinging like needles, but he welcomed it. Scout moved in close, laying his head on Thorn's boot, sighing with a profound release of tension. Thorn watched the flames lick at the darkness. This was the first victory. They had altered the physics of their environment. They had created light where there was dark, and heat where there was cold. "We aren't done yet, Scout," Thorn murmured, staring into the embers, "but we're here." Thirst came in the night, a dry, scratching torment that woke Thorn from a fitful doze. He had eaten a handful of snow the day before, a rookie mistake that had lowered his core temperature and burned his mouth, but had done little to hydrate him. You could not eat snow to survive. The energy required to melt it in the body cost more than the water gave back. He sat up. The fire burned down to a bed of glowing coals. He needed a system. Survival was nothing but a series of systems, one after another, creating order out of chaos. He took the tin cup and scooped it full of clean white powder from near the entrance, packing it tight. He set the cup on a flat rock near the coals, not directly in the fire, which would scorch the tin and boil the water away too fast, but close enough to radiate heat. He watched the white mass slump and turn to liquid. It took an agonizingly long time to yield just a few swallows of water. He drank it warm, feeling it wash down his dust-coated throat. He filled the cup again for Scout. The dog lapped it up eagerly, his tail thumping a slow rhythm against the floor. "We need a bed," Thorn stated. The stone floor was sucking the heat out of them faster than the fire could replace it. Conduction was a silent killer. He looked at the dawn light filtering through the wall he had built. It was time for another expedition. He took the hatchet again. This time he went for the living trees. He found a spruce tree struggling on the ledge below and began to harvest the lower boughs. He didn't take them all from one side. He moved around the tree, taking only what he needed, leaving the tree healthy enough to survive. He was a rancher, not a locust. He took care of the land that fed him. He hauled the massive pile of green boughs back to the cave. The scent was overpowering. Fresh, sharp Christmas air. He began to weave them. This was a skill his father had taught him 50 years ago. He laid the larger branches effectively as springs, the curve of the wood facing down to create a bounce. Then he layered the smaller, softer fronds on top, weaving them together in a thick, interlocking mat. He built the mattress nearly a foot thick in the smaller sleeping alcove he had arranged. When he laid the wool blanket over the boughs, it was no longer a hard surface. It was a bed. Thorn sat on it to test the give. It held him off the cold stone. It trapped the dead air beneath him, using it as insulation. Scout hopped up immediately, circling 3 times before collapsing into the softness with a groan of pure luxury. Thorn lay back, staring at the soot-stained ceiling of the cave. The fire crackled nearby, the water cup was steaming, and the bed was soft. They had heat, they had water, and they had shelter. The panic of the eviction, the shame of the loss, began to recede, replaced by the primal satisfaction of having solved the immediate problem. He was not a rancher with land anymore. He was a man in a cave. And strangely, as he listened to the wind batter the outside of his stone wall, he felt more like the master of his domain than he had in years. Hunger changed things. By the third day, the hunger was no longer a dull ache. It was a sharp, cramping pain that made Thorn's hands tremble and his vision swim when he stood up too fast. The small sack of cornmeal was dwindling. He had been making a thin gruel, mixing a handful of meal with hot water, sharing half with Scout. It was enough to keep the stomach from digesting itself, but it provided no fuel for the heavy labor of survival. They needed protein. They needed fat. Without it, the cold would eventually win, the body simply running out of the calories required to shiver. Thorn checked his rifle. 6 rounds. He could not risk a shot unless he was certain. A missed shot was a disaster. It wasted a bullet and scared game away for miles. But hunting in deep snow was difficult. The deer had moved to lower elevations, miles away, to escape the drifts. He didn't have the energy to trek that far. He had to rely on what was here. He needed to be smarter than the hunger. He set the rifle aside and reached for the coil of rusted wire he had salvaged. Snares. They were silent, they worked while he slept, and they cost no ammunition. "Come on, boy," he whispered to Scout. "Stay close. No barking." They moved into the brush along the cliff edge. Thorn looked for runs, small tunnels in the undergrowth where rabbits or hares moved. He found a set of tracks, faint indentations in the snow leading under a juniper bush. He worked with bare hands, his fingers stiff and clumsy. He fashioned a simple noose from the wire, tying it to a sturdy root and suspending the loop at head height for a hare. He placed small twigs to guide the animal into the path. He set 4 snares in total, covering the most likely avenues of movement. It was a gamble. He was betting his life on the habits of a rodent. They returned to the cave to wait. The waiting was the hardest part. The mind drifted to food, steaks sizzling on a cast iron pan, hot biscuits, coffee thick with cream. Thorn forced the thoughts away. He busied himself with organizing the cave, stacking the remaining firewood, cleaning the rifle. As the sun began to dip, casting long blue shadows across the snow, he knew he had to check. If the snares were empty, they would go to sleep hungry again. He walked the line. The first snare was empty, the wire undisturbed. The second was knocked over but empty, a failure. His heart sank, a heavy stone in his chest. He approached the third snare under the juniper. The snow was thrashed. A large snowshoe hare lay still, the wire pulled tight. Thorn fell to his knees, not in prayer, but in sheer, overwhelming relief. He touched the animal's fur, feeling the warmth still lingering. "Thank you," he whispered to the silence. "Thank you." Back at the cave, the mood shifted instantly. Thorn dressed the hare efficiently, saving the pelt. It would be useful later. He roasted the meat over the fire on a spit of green wood. The smell of cooking meat was intoxicating. Scout sat at attention, drool dripping from his jowls, eyes locked on the prize. Thorn didn't make him wait. He cut a generous portion of the hind quarter and tossed it to the dog, who caught it in mid-air. Thorn ate slowly, savoring the grease, the texture, the life-giving energy of the meat. As he chewed, he looked around the cave. The firelight danced on the stone walls. The windbreak held firm. The bough bed waited in the corner. He had arrived here with nothing but a dog and a coat. Now he had a home. It was primitive. It was harsh, but it was his. And for the first time since the fire took his ranch, Thorne felt a flicker of something he hadn't expected to feel again. Hope. The blizzard that arrived on the 6th night was not merely weather. It was a siege. It began with a drop in pressure so sudden that Thorne felt it pop in his ears, followed by a silence that was heavier than the wind. Then the sky fell. The snow did not drift. It drove horizontally, a wall of white grit that scoured the canyon walls and buried the landmarks. Inside the cave, the world shrank to the circle of firelight. Thorne sat with his back against the stone, feeding the fire stick by stick, miserly with his precious woodpile. He had built the windbreak well, but the storm found the cracks, whistling through the gaps in the stones with a high, mournful flute sound that grated on the nerves. Snow accumulated inside the entrance, creeping toward the fire like a slow white tide. Thorne spent hours simply shoveling it back with a flat piece of slate, a Sisyphean task that kept his blood moving but drained his reserves. "Listen to that devil," Thorne muttered, his voice sounding thin against the roaring darkness outside. Scout was curled into a tight ball on the bough bed, his nose tucked under his tail, only his eyes moving to watch Thorne pace. The dog whined, a high-pitched sound of distress that mirrored Thorne's own internal tension. They were trapped. To leave the cave now was suicide. Visibility was zero, and the wind chill would freeze exposed flesh in minutes. The snare lines were buried, likely useless. The water supply, the snow near the entrance, was plentiful, but the fuel to melt it was the limiting factor. Thorne did the math in his head, over and over. 3 days of wood if he burned it low. 2 days if he kept it high enough to truly warm them. The storm could last 4. By the 2nd day of the storm, the confinement began to weigh on them. The cave, once a sanctuary, felt like a prison cell. The smoke from the fire, unable to escape cleanly through the turbulent air at the mouth, swirled back down, stinging their eyes and coating their throats with soot. Thorne coughed, a racking sound that echoed off the damp walls. He forced himself to maintain a routine to stave off the madness of cabin fever. He cleaned the rifle again. He mended a tear in his coat with the rusted wire, punching holes in the leather with his knife tip. He talked to Scout, telling the dog stories of the ranch, of the high pastures in July, of the way the creek used to sing over the stones. Anything to fill the silence with something other than the wind. "We'll see the grass again, Scout," he promised, his voice raspy from smoke. "Just got to outlast the white." It was a battle of patience, a test of who would blink first, the man or the winter. The storm broke on the 4th morning, leaving a world transformed. The valley was gone, replaced by a smooth, undulating ocean of white that sparkled with blinding intensity under a cold, hard sun. Thorne emerged from the cave, shielding his eyes, and stepped into drifts that reached his waist. They had survived the siege, but the cost was high. The woodpile was reduced to a few pathetic scraps, and the rabbit meat was gone. They needed to move, to replenish, but the snow was treacherous. Scout bounded out, eager for release, but within moments the dog yelped, a sharp, piercing cry that stopped Thorne's heart. Thorne waded forward, panic rising in his chest. Scout was holding his right foreleg up, blood dripping bright red onto the pristine snow. The dog had stepped on a jagged shard of shale hidden beneath the powder, slicing the pad of his paw deep. Thorne dropped to his knees, ignoring the cold soaking through his trousers, and grabbed the dog's collar. "Let me see," he commanded, his voice shaking. Scout licked his hand, whining, but allowed Thorne to lift the paw. The cut was nasty, a deep gash that gaped open. In the sterilized world of a hospital, it would be a minor stitch job. Here, in the filth and freeze, it was a death sentence. Infection would set in, or the dog would be unable to hunt or travel. Thorne hauled the 90-pound animal back into the cave, carrying him over the threshold. He laid Scout on the bough bed and went to work. He had no bandages, no antiseptic. He looked at his own clothes. He was wearing a flannel shirt under his coat, one he had worn for weeks. It was dirty. That wouldn't do. He looked at the hem of his long johns, cleaner but not sterile. He made a decision. He took his knife and cut a strip from the cleanest part of the wool blanket, then threw the strip into the boiling water cup on the fire. He let it boil for 10 minutes to kill the unseen killers. While it cooled, he packed the wound with clean snow to stop the bleeding, speaking soft, nonsensical words of comfort to the animal. "I got you, partner. I got you." When the wool was cool enough, he bound the paw tight, tying it off with a piece of the wire. Scout watched him with eyes full of pain and confusion, but didn't snap. Thorne sat back, exhausted. The dog couldn't walk in the deep snow now. Thorne would have to do the hunting alone. He would have to do the wood gathering alone. The burden of survival had just doubled, but looking at the dog resting his head on the bandage, Thorne knew he would carry it. He would carry the world for this dog if he had to. Hunger returned with a vengeance, sharper and more demanding than before. The snares were buried under 4 feet of drift, inaccessible. Thorne knew he had to hunt big game. He couldn't sustain them on rodents anymore, especially with Scout healing. He needed a deer, or better, an elk. He took the rifle and the remaining 5 rounds. He left Scout in the cave with a stern command to stay, piling the last of the wood near the fire so the dog could feel the warmth for a few hours. Thorne trekked toward the lower tree line, his homemade snowshoes, fashioned the day before from willow branches and wire, keeping him atop the worst of the drifts. He moved slowly, scanning the horizon. The landscape was empty. The storm had driven the game deep into the timber. He walked for 3 miles, his breath tearing at his lungs, his legs burning. He found nothing. No tracks, no sign. The despair began to creep in, a cold whisper suggesting that this was the end, that the storm had wiped the slate clean of life. Then he saw it. A flash of tan against the gray trunks of a distant aspen grove. He froze, lowering his profile. Through the sights of the rifle, he made out the shape of a mule deer buck, stripping bark from a tree. It was gaunt, winter-weary, but it was meat. It was survival. The distance was far, 200 yards, maybe more. His hands were shaking from the exertion and the cold. Thorne forced himself to breathe, to lower his heart rate. He leaned against a pine trunk, using it as a rest. He couldn't afford to miss. He couldn't afford to wound it and chase it for miles. It had to be clean. He whispered the old mantra his father had taught him. Aim small, miss small. He put the bead of the sight just behind the buck's shoulder. He exhaled, watching the steam of his breath clear the barrel. He squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle was deafening, slapping against the canyon walls. The buck dropped where it stood, a sack of stones. Thorne didn't cheer. He didn't smile. He simply slumped against the tree, closing his eyes for a moment as the tension drained out of him, leaving him weak. Then the work began. He had to dress the animal and drag 150 pounds of dead weight 3 miles uphill through snow. It would take him the rest of the day and half the night. But tonight they would eat. Tonight the cave would smell of roasting venison. The weeks that followed the kill were a time of transformation. The cave ceased to be a shelter and became a workshop, a hub of industry. Thorne did not waste a scrap of the deer. The meat that they did not eat immediately he sliced into thin strips. He built a smoking rack from green willow branches near the entrance, where the smoke from the fire naturally drafted out. He kept a low, smoky fire burning for days, curing the meat into jerky that would last them until spring. The scent of hickory and venison permeated the stone, replacing the smell of fear and dust. Thorne turned his attention to the hide. He scraped it clean with his knife. a tedious, messy job that required hours of elbow grease. He stretched it out on a frame of branches to dry. It wouldn't be professional-grade leather, but with the hair left on, it would be a rug, a blanket, a source of incredible warmth. He placed it over the bough bed, fur side up. That night, when Scout, his paw now healing, the limp reduced to a favor of the leg, curled up on the deer hide, the dog let out a groan of comfort that made Thorne chuckle. "Livin' like kings, Scout," Thorne said, whittling a piece of bone into a needle. He was sewing a pouch for his cartridges. He had also solved the light problem. He had rendered the fat from the deer's suet in the tin cup, pouring the liquid tallow into a hollowed-out depression in a stone. He used a strip of his cotton shirt as a wick. When he lit it, the tallow lamp burned with a steady yellow flame, brighter and more consistent than the erratic firelight. It allowed him to work after the sun went down. He looked around the cave. The walls were soot-stained, yes, but the floor was swept. The woodpile was stacked high again, replenished with focused effort. The larder was full of dried meat. The windbreak wall had been reinforced with mud and ice, making it airtight. It was no longer a hole in the ground. It was a home. He realized with a start that he hadn't thought about the bank, or the sheriff, or the burning ranch house in days. Those memories, which had been sharp shards of glass in his mind, were dulling. The valley below was the world of men, of paper deeds and laws that could strip a man of his dignity. But up here, in the rock and the snow, the only law was physics. If you worked, you ate. If you built, you stayed warm. It was an honest life, harder than any he had known, but cleaner. Spring did not arrive with a fanfare. It arrived with the sound of dripping water. It started as a rhythmic plink-plink at the cave entrance, a metronome counting down the end of the long freeze. Thorne woke one morning to find the light different, softer, less blue. The air smelled of wet stone and pine resin. He walked to the ledge, Scout trotting beside him on 4 sound legs, the bandage long since removed. The snow on the south-facing slopes was retreating, pulling back like a receding tide to reveal patches of brown, dead grass. But beneath the brown, if you looked closely, there was the electric green of new shoots. The pass was clearing. The way down to the valley, to the town, to civilization, was opening up. Thorne stood on the precipice, looking down at the distant ribbons of smoke from the homesteads miles away. He could go back. He could take his labor to a ranch, hire himself out as a hand, sleep in a bunkhouse, eat at a table with other men. He could try to scrape together enough coin to start over in the way society expected. He watched a hawk circle the thermals below, free and unburdened. He looked down at Scout. The dog was healthy, his coat thick and glossy from the venison fat, his eyes bright. They had come here to die, or at least to wait for the end. Instead, they had forged something iron hard between them. Thorne looked back at the cave. The windbreak wall was sturdy. The interior was dry and stocked. The view from his front porch was better than any mansion in the territory. "We aren't going down, are we?" Thorne asked softly. Scout looked up, ears pricked, waiting for the command. Thorne turned his back on the valley floor. He wasn't the old rancher who had lost everything anymore. He was the man of the high country. He had built this life with his own hands, stone by stone, calorie by calorie. It belonged to him in a way the deeded land never had. He rested his hand on Scout's head and pointed toward the higher peaks, where the elk were moving up for the summer grazing. "Let the snow melt," Thorne said, a quiet strength in his voice that matched the granite around him. "We've got work to do up here." He walked back into the cave, not to pack, but to tend the fire that was now the heart of his home.